We don't realize that white supremacy influences every aspect of our society. In fact, I just happened to read an article this past week that, thanks to social media, I found on Twitter, it's called, right? And the title is something like this. I tend to forget full titles lately. I guess I'm getting old.
They don't use them on Twitter.
Yeah. It was the racial exclusion of citations in the scholarly world. And we're thinking of Jim Cone. I thought of him immediately when I saw that title, because I remember being in a meeting with him at one occasion in which he said, why are we speaking about Immanuel Kant as if he's the only person that is worth it? Why aren't we speaking about students who know Baldwin well? And you could dismiss easily what he was saying, or not easily if he was there, but you could try to dismiss it, because I was thinking to myself, even I would dare say for all of us in this room, it's difficult for us to really put Kant and Baldwin to par. And it's not, the reason we're able to do this because we really think that Kant is superior, because anything European is superior, and that's really white supremacy that allows us to think in that way, even if we're people of color. So white supremacy infiltrates all that we do. One last thing.
Yes.
Talking about Twitter, it fascinates me how students, not only of Union, PhD students from all over the place, love to cite Paul Tillich, Niebuhr, Heidegger, Feuerbach, Marx, to impress people, and forget to cite Jim Cone. Now everybody's citing him because he passed away, or other people that are not part of that canon of intellectual life.
Yeah, what you remind us of, and sort of as we move to this now discussion of white supremacy as opposed to simply racism, is how indeed it infiltrates every system, every structure, our ways of thinking, and even for those who are non-white, their ways of thinking about themselves. And so we often spoke of how people of color can't be racist, but now when we think about white supremacy, we can talk more fully of how people of color can indeed embrace white supremacist narratives, and perhaps unwittingly and sometimes wittingly. But it leads me to a question for you, Robert Wright Lee, and that name, Robert Wright Lee. And you've never turned away from that name, and you've never turned away from your ancestry, and have been unapologetic in some respects that this was your ancestor, and owned what that has meant. And so I have always been struck by that fact. So a couple of questions that leads me to. The first, what has been the challenge for you of carrying that name, a name that has indeed, in your own words, been an icon of a person who's been an icon for white supremacy? And then what can we perhaps can white America learn from you in the way in which you have navigated the reality, your own personal story of what it means to be the ancestor and carry the name of Robert E. Lee?
Well, I think one of the things that gets me, I was giving blood the other day, and as the person had their needle in my arm, they said, "Oh, that's a really cool name." I get that a lot in the South, especially where I live. And it enters into a conversation that I'm always afraid to have, especially when they have needles in my arm, as to what that means, what that name holds, what's in a name, if you will. Robert Lee is a name that carries a lot of weight, especially in the parts of the world that I live in. And I've had everything from people at Lowe's tell me that the South will rise again when I'm just trying to buy a cactus, to people saying, how could you even keep that name as part of your identity, right? There's this question, why would you keep that name? Well, part of me sees it as this, I want to be a different end note to history. I want to be a Robert Lee that did some good in this world. There is such thing as redemption and redeeming the past, restoring the years. I can't do anything about what my ancestor did, but I can certainly change the narrative about how his descendants responded to his actions. Because for me, as a white person, I've had to learn the hard way that speaking up, even about these issues as a white person, can cost you. And there is a certain buy-in that you have to make with the rest of the world if you're going to speak up and stand up for people who are marginalized, because people aren't going to like that. There are rural parts of my county that, they voted 97% for Donald Trump, and that's a hard space to navigate as someone who wants to change the narrative. Because when you talk about social media and the proliferation thereof, I think that what's happened, we see Donald Trump using it expertly, if you will, to get to his base. We've got to think about ways that we who are combating this, like Sean so expertly does, confront those powers at be, whether that be the ancestry that I have or the white supremacist that's sitting in the pew. We have to confront those for what they are, and we can use social media in a really great way, and we can be really healthy about it. And I think that's very important.
Thank you. Social media keeps coming up. Your student generation is one of the generations, if not the first generation in many respects, that has fully grown up in this cyber age, and for which social media to you is the way black and white television was for me, right? So what is the power of social media? How do you see social media really impacting not only this fight against white supremacy, but I want to ask you another question. How is white supremacy reflected through the use of social media?
That's a good question. So the first one is how are we using it? Mm-hmm. Well, one of the most common ways, and I mean, I'm 33, so I don't have Twitter, so I mean, I'm primarily on Facebook.
That generation, yeah.
But what I definitely see is I see a lot of educating people about the issues, but then there's also an opportunity to challenge the dominant narrative. Like, I'm not checking for CNN, MSNBC. I want to see what my homies have to say about, this speech or something that happened. So that's a way that our generation can certainly take back the narrative and leverage our voices. And, it's also used really practically for quick mobilizing. Mm-hmm. Like, hey, protest down over here. And, it goes viral and people are there. And, one of the primary reasons I know of Sean King is because whenever he drops a video, it goes viral. So those are the ways that I see us using social media. And for me personally, I use it as a form of self-care at times, just looking at memes and looking at funny things, because it's like, this is depressing. That's just the reality of it. So I'm back and forth between mobilizing and seeing what people are doing, and then also getting my laugh on. But even with social media, one thing I just want to stress is that one-to-one interaction is something that we cannot lose in the age of social media. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about confronting white supremacy, that is what's going to be needed. And that's the importance I see also of our congregations, in particular white congregations, in working one-on-one with their members who may harbor white supremacist feelings, because social media is not going to do it all.
Well, did you want to follow up?
I just think that's so important to point out about the importance of a one-to-one relationship. I was talking about this today with one of my friends at lunch, that I think we're not going to change Uncle Bob and Aunt Jill by tweeting at them. Right. We are going to change them by confronting them at our Thanksgiving table. And that's scary as hell. I mean, truly, I just want to eat my turkey and go home, and my mom just wants me to eat my turkey and go home. But for goodness sakes, we have to be willing to say to Uncle Bob, hey, by the way, that comment is out of line. And it's that relational shift and that narrative shift that is so important for white folk to be doing in their own circles before we, engage.
Well, which leads me to this, particularly in relationship to your experiences in your congregation, Reverend Lee, when you began to talk about and confront white supremacy from your pulpit, when you came out for the taking down of your ancestors' statue, when you came out and supported Black Lives Matter. You were forced to resign from your pulpit in your white Southern church. So what is the hope of the white church and white congregations if indeed they are pushing out persons like you from the pulpit when you try to confront this issue of white supremacy, which I believe white pastors have to do in their congregations, but then you do it and you get pushed out. And even to your own admission, you said this is a message that they aren't used to hearing in the white pulpit, and so you got pushed out. Where's the hope?
Here's the hope. I'm 25. I didn't know what a pension was when I resigned, so I wasn't worried about that. I know that for some older preachers and even faculty members, the idea of losing everything you've built up is a dangerous idea, and that's why I think a lot of white preachers aren't confronting this. We live in a system that enables white supremacists to be in the pews and have the power and put the money in the offering plates, and then when they hold that back, we say, oh my God, we've said something wrong. What we have to be willing to do is risk something big for something good, because while I don't see a lot of hope in the white church right now, I am a believer in the resurrection, and I believe that even the white church can be resurrected and can combat these problems, these systemic problems, in a way that is healthy and in a way that is faithful and effective. I don't have all the answers. I don't have a magic bullet. If I did, I would be making millions writing books about it. But what I do know is that there are people out there trying to make a change in the churches, and we have to enable them and support them, not only with our prayers, but with our admonitions to carry on and to keep fighting and to make those little movements towards justice.
Sean, I'm struck that as Robert speaks, he talks, and rightfully so, about what's at stake as white ministers or white people speak out against white supremacy, etc. But there's always been a lot at stake for black folks and people of color because they don't speak out, and because they have sustained the kind of silence, talking of white churches and the white community, that allows white supremacy to fester, to grow, etc., and that can hold, for instance, a Donald Trump. Talk to us a little bit about what really is at stake for us, and you talk a lot about the lives that are daily lost to the violence that is white supremacy, and the way in which various laws such as the drug laws and all of those are becoming, again, even though we have legalization of marijuana, but how you're having this re-institutionalization of these laws, et cetera, that again put our very lives at stake. And so there's something more at stake in non-white America for those who have to live under the whole culture, if you will, and the violence of white supremacy. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Thinking through all of those things and even through your question, one of the beautiful things about social media is that it connects us to people who may share our thoughts and philosophies and worldview. Like, there was a point in my life, I'm 38, there was a point when I was a teenager, even in my early 20s, where I saw the world in a way that no one else around me saw the world like that. Now, all over the world, people shared that view, but they just weren't in my zip code, they weren't in my text messages, and all of a sudden, social media allows you to connect with people who may have a similar theology or philosophy or worldview, who may share your approach or style, and it helps remind you that you're not alone. And one of the things that has done for me, like I've always fought against injustice. Like it's even connected to my own personal story and pain. But many times in that fight, I felt very lonely in it. And social media allowed me to connect with other people who were as bothered by not just incidents of injustice, but the ugliness of the system itself. And part of what we are able to do, so even as I just think about my direct messages today on Twitter, for instance, I DM'd with women and men all over the country and all around the world about different unique ways that we're trying to dismantle this system. One of the things that is very, very present, like right before we got in here today, in Charlottesville in August, a group of white men who turned out to be very dangerous, lifelong bigots brutally assaulted this young man, DeAndre Harris. And I saw it happen almost in real time, and I had the thought, it was so vicious and so ugly. And I saw a video of it and a photo of it, and my first thought was, this is disturbing. And then immediately I pivoted to the thought, if these men are able to do this in broad daylight, in the parking lot of the police department, if they're able to do this and not be held accountable, what makes this generation's consequences any different than those in 1954 who tried to hold the men who killed Emmett Till accountable but couldn't? The system didn't move. And so we leveraged social media to identify these men, to have them arrested, to collect evidence. And just 2 days ago, the first man was convicted. Just a few hours ago, the second man was convicted. And to me, justice is rare. It's rare. I have worked with probably 450 or so families affected by either police violence or racial violence. Maybe one or two of them have gotten justice. Maybe one or two. So to see it, and yet it's still very disappointing, because DeAndre Harris is still wounded. He's still, not just the scars on his face and head, but he's still just interrupted his whole life. And two of the most vicious men in the attack, we couldn't even identify them, and they're still on the loose. And it appears that we're completely on our own in this system of justice. And so increasingly, as we fight back against this system, many of us who are in the fight realize that it's not going to do us much good to say, hey, pointing to the system, we need you to do better. More and more, like whatever justice we're going to get, we're going to have to do it ourselves.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
And there's a role for the church in that. I want to talk about that again in a minute, but your comment leads me to another thought. And even as we're talking about this thing of social media and people connecting through social media, one of the interesting things is that we know the generation we have before us, millennials and generation, whatever's after millennials, what is it, Z or Y, that these generations are the most diverse. They are also more likely than any other generation to come in contact with persons who are different than themselves. Yet, even with that said, studies have revealed that their level of bias and that the stereotypes they carry are just as strong or stronger than the baby boomer generation, which would be my generation. So one of the most disappointing things, it seems, as you speak of disappointment, has been to see that in the forefront of some of these white supremacist rallies, like in Charlottesville and other places, are really young people. So what do we say about that? I'm going to start with you, Daniel.
Well,
How are we to understand that?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I think that's why it's important we use the word white supremacy as opposed to racism. Because someone can always have a black or Latino friend, but if you idolize white supremacy, that's where all that other stuff comes in, and I'm not shocked. I went to a evangelical Baptist school growing up. It was, for the most part, all white. And I would go to school loving myself, and I would come home hating my blackness, right? But I had parents that would check me, and they'd say, look, I know you're not learning about black people in your school. I just want you to learn how to do math and science, though, because they're good at that. Here, read these books and get me some reports by the end of the week. I can't, and so that's the only reason, that's the reason why I am the way I am today, and I thank God for that. And I can't help but wonder, did the other white students have that? If I came home hating my blackness and idolizing whiteness, and my parents had to get that out of me, is that being done to the white students? And was that being done for the other students of color as well? And if I didn't get that, how would I be today?
No, I think what you're talking about are those important conversations that black parents and others have with their children to help them to affirm who they are, and it always leads to the question I've often wondered, what are the conversations that white folks are having in their households? And one of the things that this focus on white supremacy does is it allows us to understand that, no, it's not a black problem or a brown problem, that, this is an illness, a problem, an issue that is that of white America as well. I want to bring Serena in this conversation a little bit, and Sam, when we talk about the role of the church in combating this issue, we know that over 80% of white evangelical America voted for the Make America Great Again vision. We know that that Make America Great Again vision is nothing but a clarion call and a mantra of white supremacy, and a clarion call to white supremacists, if not a pledge of loyalty to them. So 80-some% of white evangelicals voted for them, but so too did 60% of white Catholics vote for that vision. So too did 58% of non-evangelical white Protestants. White Christian America supported the Make America Great Again vision. What's the hope for the white church in trying to dismantle and dissect and deconstruct this thing of white supremacy? What was it about this vision for America that resonated so well with white Christian America? So I'll let you jump in on that. And Sam, help us out.
I mean, so just to back up a little bit, one of the reasons, of the many reasons why it's important that the conversation shifts and we start talking about white supremacists is because it forces white people to recognize that their reality and the way they carry themselves through the world, their unconscious lives, the way they inhabit their bodies, the way they dream at night, the way they relate to people on the street, every facet of their existence is structured according to the privileges and the capacities and the power that they're given in the world by virtue of the color of their skin. And that is something that has not been interrogated. That is something that floats over the surface of white America as if when we're talking about white supremacy, oh yes, we're talking about members of the Klan and nobody likes that, and of course I'm a white person but I'm all for civil rights, so how could you possibly talk about me being a racist? And the fact of the matter is that's the conversation that has stopped us from dealing with the fact that whiteness is a social construct that grew out of chattel slavery and grew out of the creation of people who were capable of the cruelty that supported the system for 300 years and then supported it for the next 200 years of Jim Crow. You had to create people who were capable of being that cruel and being that blind and refusing to see what they were doing or happily inflicting violence and not flinching on the bodies of black and brown people. And it's only when we start talking about white supremacy that white people have to deal with the fact that that is them. And even if it's not up here in your head as a conscious thought, it's in your body, it's in your legacy, it's in your bones, it's in your blood. You are that texture and flesh of that constructed reality. And so for the church to deal with white supremacy, the church has to first tell the truth about itself. That in the United States, Christianity underwrote, supported, justified, upheld the creation of chattel slavery and Jim Crow, and continues to do so. I mean, that's just the honest truth about it. That's what it is. And until that's uncovered, the church can't begin to move forward. So anyway,
Yes, Sam, because you've said that you've seen more white supremacy and racism in the church than anywhere else. You want to speak to that?
I think that what concerns me is that until we don't change what I would call the means of intellectual or theological production, we can't change the means of social reproduction, which is how we think. And the church, so it concerns me because the murder of black and brown people by police in this country is horrific. However, the intentional destruction of black and brown people starts when they're 3- and 4-year-olds. Studies show that black and brown boys especially, and girls, but black and brown boys especially, are targeted in school as not being capable or shouldn't even be there, even by sometimes teachers of color. So the destruction and death of people of color begins very early, and not only in the streets. And it's actually in the millions because it's all black and brown people. So we need to start rethinking how we do theology. And perhaps, for example, the reason I said that the church is the most racist institution I've been at, when I nuanced it, what I meant was that they could be outwardly racist because religion has always been one of the most powerful forces of legitimation of anything you want to legitimate. So what I've heard quite often is people say, yes, I'm a racist, but I'm a saint and a sinner. So they justify with that theology, and I say that that's the theology of racist justification of lay people. But we have an intellectual or academic theology, which is where I think this lay theology comes from, which is called Christian realism. I think it was created by Niebuhr. And when you looked at the notion of Christian realism, you could only say that if you're in a position of power. Because if he would have been challenged in his whitehood, he would have fought back and not said, well, this is the way things are. Is asking people to accept things and justify it in the name of some theology of justification by faith. So I think that the whole, the church's theology has to be done away with, basically, and start from anew, and maybe start from a different perspective, which Cone and Latin American theologians spoke about quite a bit. But if you notice, and I'll end, I don't want to take too much time, we continue to cite and quote not Gutierrez,
Right.
not Cone, not El Satames, but the white theologians who, if you look at their histories, supported white supremacy. How could you get out of it if you're producing the same thing?
Yeah, I know. I agree
So,
so
yeah,
much.
jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. I co-sign all of that, and
Right.
so much of what I'm also dealing with. I'm a historian by training. Is when we begin to get to the roots of who created the systems that we use, who they were intended for, what their purpose was. It's pervasive. I've become friends with so many guys who are athletes in the NFL, and what they painfully our understanding is that you can commit horrific crimes. Your character can be awful, and you can be allowed back into the league. But that when you do something that threatens the white power structure, you will be effectively banned from this league. And you say, well, why? Well, who created that league? For whose entertainment was that league created? And so when you understand, oh, this league was created to entertain primarily white men, and white men are not entertained by a black fist or taking a knee during the day. That does not entertain them remotely. And so we have to get to the root of, well, wow, how many of our institutions were created with other people in mind, and how long are we going to keep trying to squeeze ourselves into these other frameworks with just the hope that it's going to work? Because what we keep finding is that it doesn't. And it's a complex point to make, but we also have not interrogated and investigated enough, not publicly, and we haven't confronted the trade-off of integration in America. And like just recently, it was Jackie Robinson's birthday, and I love and revere Jackie Robinson. I spoke at the foundation, but I've come to understand him breaking into Major League Baseball was the destruction of the Negro Leagues. And what we have to find is each new white institution that was integrated was a subsequent destruction of a beautiful black institution. And we have not come to grips with those costs, and so much of what we're I'm hearing people talk about it. It's the beauty of Afrofuturism, of saying, hey, how can it's what we could critique. There are many smart critiques of Black Panther, but it's what made it a spiritual experience for some of us to say, oh, here is a form of existence outside of white supremacy, not infected by it, not built on top of it. And so many of us are just trying to imagine what that would look like, but it has to begin with those practices. Who do we cite? Who are our sources? What institutions are we leaning on? And many of us need to be need to be pioneers in this effort.
Yeah, I affirm all of that, and it leads me to think about a couple of things. One, of course, in the black community, historically, we've relied on the church, right? That independent institution that could always put forth those, first of all, affirming messages, that could also take up the slack, so to speak, as Richard Wright used to call it, it's the oasis in the middle of the desert for black people. So where the society and social systems let us down, well, the black church would then fill in the gaps. And so we had that sort of independent institution, and so we ask ourselves, where are those institutions today? On the other side of that, I think about the white church and the white community. And when we talk about these messages, as you speak of, Danielle, of that conversation that your parents would have, or the conversations that would go on in the black church, well, conversations have to go on in the white community. They have to go on in the white church. And I often say that Cone talked about, of course, always the black Christ and the black Jesus. Well, these images and icons of the black and brown Jesus, they're significant in black and brown churches, but they're more important to have in white churches. So that white people can see a sacredness in bodies that are not white. So I'm wondering what kind of conversations, particularly when you find yourself probably in a position that you get pushed out again, going back to that question, what kind of conversations need to happen there in the white church?
when I was in undergrad at Appalachian State, I found out I was going to Duke for divinity school, and Duke has its own struggles with blackness, dare I say.
They're in the middle of
They're in the middle of a crisis,
right now. Right.
And I'm so glad that my undergraduate professor encouraged me to read The Cross and the Lynching Tree before going to Duke. Because such a Southern institution like Duke, or any of our Southern institutions, is so deeply ingrained in its history, whether that's the church or an institution of higher learning, that we forget to call out ourselves on our complacency. I grew up at a church that told me police were helpers and you should run to them. We learned that in Sunday school. I could walk downtown near my church with a hoodie on and not worry about being shot by the police because of what they thought was under that hoodie. These are the conversations that my parents had with me. You know, go to the police. They are the helpers. They are the people you need to go to, instead of watch out for them because they might shoot you. There's a big dichotomy there. There's an economy there too, right? I mean, we've got these people that I got pulled over the other day. I was so pissed off, but I knew deep down that I was going to be okay giving that man my license. Whereas there might be a person in my community that was targeted because they had a headlight out, and then all of a sudden they find themselves in prison. There is a deep difference in my experience growing up. I went to a fundamentalist school. My parents, it was a good school. I mean, it was a great place. My parents are great people, but they thought that I needed a school that I could go to. And again, it taught me to hate that blackness. Because I remember the track team telling all of the students at that school that black people had an extra bone in their body, and that's why our all-white track team lost to the black people that were at the public school. I'm not kidding here. I'm not trying to make a joke. It's the real nature.
Jimmy the Greek said that.
Yeah, it's the real nature of what we're talking about that has gotten so deeply ingrained in our systems that we can't even get away from it.
I'll talk about, I grew up with a single mother in rural Kentucky, and she's the sweetest white woman I know. I'm writing a memoir about my life growing up mixed but in a white household, and I talk about how different growing up in my house, a white house, is than growing up in my house with my wife and my kids, a black house. White people, white children have a very low racial IQ. Like in my house, my mother was a sweet, loving woman. We had no conversations about race, none. No conversations about racism. It did not exist in our house. And I talk about the pain of, like, my mother was not my mother, my father, she was just my mother. And when I got to the high school that I attended, I walked into this complicated space where race mattered. And I was not taught the rules. I was not given insight. So even as a teenager, I'm learning on the fly what it meant for me to operate in these spaces. Now, my youngest kids are 5 and 10 and 12. My 5-year-old's racial IQ was higher than my teenage racial IQ. Because in our house, at our dinner table, in the car, everywhere we go in my house, we talk about race. It's not, it's just called life. Every single day, all day long, we're talking about the uniqueness of what race, we don't use these terms, but what it means. And the way I grew up is probably very similar to the way Rob grew up. We just didn't talk about any of it in our house. And I think the question is important, like when you asked it earlier, like, well, what are white people saying at the table? Not a thing.
Which is-
Nothing. Because they don't have to,
Right.
and because this society doesn't require it of them, they can function in privilege and power without any of what, like Rob said, there's no what can I wear? You know, we talk about the talk. There's no talk. And so it's a revelation when people say like, oh, really? And so what happens is you get to be a fully functioning adult in society, white in society, and your racial IQ is low.
Well, I'm sorry.
When white people talk, it's scary, though. It's probably better that they don't. No, I'm going to explain myself. It seems like white institutions, all they want to do when it comes to race is anti-racism training. How do you train somebody not to be racist? There has to be consequences for the racism. In my denomination, the ELCA, the Metro New York Synod, finally discovered in 2018 that they're racist. It took them this long, and they're doing anti-racism training. That's just to perpetuate the white supremacy, in my opinion, and to feel good about themselves, because nothing really changes. If you really want to do something about racism, change the power structure of your institution. Start there at least. Not that that guarantees, because there are people who haven't, they usually find the right folk from our communities to put in there. Union is special in that way, not because the president's here. No, seriously. But I'm being serious. But a lot of these institutions, so it's scary when they speak because they find a way to perpetuate, continue with the same system with anti-racism. It's like training police officers on how not to kill people.
And what that doesn't do, and I think listening to this conversation, building upon what Sean says, what that doesn't do is to get at the root of the problem and to face the fact. And Sean has said on many occasions, and others have said that white supremacy is in the DNA of this country and is the foundation upon which this country is built. I'm going to hand the mic, just wait a minute, but just say one thing. When you talk about the conversations that white people aren't having, or the fact, Sean, that there was no conversation on about race in your household that was a white household, that is the conversation. The silence itself speaks volumes. Right?
Yeah, that's just what I was going to say. I mean, that absence of a conversation is the conversation, and that is the social construction of whiteness, which is constructed to pretend as if racial IQ is actually low, when according to the standards of whiteness, that's a very high racial IQ, because that's the standards by which it's being measured, that you don't see it. And sort of identifying that construction as a living reality is part of what it's going to take to address white supremacy.
Right, I'm reminded of a story in my son's childhood. He's about 2 years old and playing in a park, and some of you will remember the Flintstones. In a Flintstone-like car in the park, and he's in the park playing, and there was an elementary school right across from the park, and so it was about recess, I guess, for the elementary school, and so they let out for recess into the park, and the kids came running down, and a couple of little white boys, about 7 or 8 years old, they looked like their age, probably first graders, little red-headed boy and a little blonde-haired boy came running down to the Flintstone car. My son was 2, he hopped out of the car, and so the 2 little boys start fighting over who was going to drive the Flintstone car. So as a 2-year-old would do, my son was looking on in amazement at these little boys fighting, and it seemed like the little blonde-haired boy was getting the best of the fight there. And pretty soon, he turns around, these are 7 or 8-year-olds, he turns around to my son with all the venom that a 7 or 8-year-old could muster. And he points his finger in my son's face, 2 years old, and he says, "You stop looking at us before I throw you in jail where you belong." Now that's a sign of the conversation that wasn't had, and or that he did have. But in what happens to form that strong sense of anti-blackness in a 7 or 8-year-old child? What were the conversations being had or not, that's right, being had? Which reminds us, of course, that we are living in a time where 75% of white America, 2/3 of white America, has no persons of color within their intimate social circles. Of that 25% of white America that does, 90% of their social circle is still white. How do we begin to break out of the way in which we see each other and respond to one another through this lens of white supremacy, through this lens of anti-blackness, when indeed we really aren't engaging with one another? Where do we go from here? Anyone?
You know, I think one of the common responses to questions like that is, oh, we have to build this beloved community and people need to be friends with people of different races. But I have white friends that still voted for a president that wants to oppress and kill off my community. So I'm not sure if making friends is what's going to solve this problem. But, you know, I think for me, just in terms of my growing of consciousness, just going back to the Word and reading about Jesus in my early 20s in the New Testament, it really, really challenged me because he was saying, treat others as you want to be treated. And, you know, growing up, we never really emphasized that, right? And so if our congregations are having and teaching what the actual Word is saying and challenging people about how they go about with their thinking, who are you excluding? And if a community is all white and there's no black or Latinos or Asian people for them to meet with, I think you can still find ways by educating people. And I think some of that non-conversation, when they don't have the conversation, what do they see? They see cops.
Right.
Right? They see, I don't know, BET. Or they see the news, right? And that says it all. So who's sitting down with them and saying, look, let me break this down for you.
Right. That's right.
This world is messed up and is targeting this community. And these are the narratives that you're getting. Let me tell you, these narratives are not real. And if you go about believing these narratives, the folks who are making that are going to get you one day. So be careful about that. So I say that to say, I think there has to be just a lot of intentionality about what messages we are preaching, how we are challenging our congregations in terms of just consciousness of the other and how we treat each other. And I wouldn't rush to the, let's go have a joint service with a black congregation. Having black, no, because I saw it all the time. And I'm like, oh gosh, we gotta make more friends with these white people who are like, hi, I'm so excited to have church with you. And I'm just like, oh, this is so awkward. You know, but.
And they think of church only, right. And they think of black worship only in one way.
Right.
And if you don't do it that way, they're disappointed because you weren't being
like,
black.
What happened to all the music I was expecting?
Right.
You know? So,
I had two thoughts there. I see, there's this very popular refrain now that white supremacists and others use. Even Trump uses it. Like, what about?
Said a white supremacist, so that was true.
What about Chicago? They'll say, what about Chicago?
Right.
They'll say, why, if Black Lives Matter, why aren't you doing more in Chicago? And when I hear that, it is the first clue to me that person has never been to Chicago. Because there are literally thousands of groups, not hundreds, thousands of groups, churches, people, organizations fighting to make the city better in so many rich, beautiful, complex ways. But thinking about the clumsiness of those shared worship experiences, I think all of us have attended one of those before. But what it also what it also told me is there is one thing that very few people cross over to. Like, I immediately know, I was like, you've never been to a funeral in Chicago. I said, because if you have been to one, I have been. If you'd been, you would have felt the pain. There's this disconnected notion that there are these emotionless people in Chicago who don't care about their own lives or communities. And my thought is, oh, you've never been to a single black funeral in Chicago. Because if you did, you would have felt the depths of pain and despair, and you would not speak with so much ignorance. You know, I do think there is some hope in education. Over the past 4 years, I have traveled and I spoke in almost 40 states now. And many of the facts that I present, I do a PowerPoint presentation, and many of the facts that I present, white folk will come up to me afterwards and ask for like the sources. They need to know because they're shocked. And there are two that I like to share. One is, there's this very long study, and even now if you Google black-white drug disparity, Washington Post, the top link is this study. And so from 1980 to 2010, a study was done on drug usage in America. And it was the most comprehensive study ever done to this very date on drug usage. And it found that for the 30-year explosion of mass incarceration, that whites and blacks in America use drugs at the exact same rate. And what blows the audience's mind is that white Americans actually sold drugs at a slightly higher rate. Not just more white people, but a higher percentage. But that African Americans were prosecuted 850% more. Thereby creating the stereotype of a drug dealer in the news, on the media, everywhere. The stereotype of a drug dealer is young and black because that's who was selectively prosecuted, but that the average drug dealer is actually white and middle-aged. Now, the reason there are very few black middle-aged drug dealers is because they were arrested in their teenage years and sent away for a very long time, whereas white drug dealers, drug usage and drug selling in most of white America is fully and completely legal. And it's treated as a medical practice, nothing else. And so, not only that, but if people of color who commit crimes were sentenced and treated identically to white Americans who commit the exact same crimes. We're not talking about different criminality, but if people of color were just given the same sentences or released, America's jails and prisons, our population will be cut in half. It's not a matter of who commits more crime, it's who's held responsible and who's held responsible for how long. And so some of it is, and I see people have light bulb moments of saying like, oh, I did not know that. Because we all, myself included, we live in our bubbles. And so we have to find creative ways to get into other people's worlds, but when we're there, we have to say so much that we maybe will never be invited back. Like, I don't get invited. Like, I go once, and my plan is not to get a return invitation. I'm going to tell you the full truth about yourself and then fly home as quickly as I can.
Before we turn to questions from the audience, let me ask all of you one question. As we've heard these stories and they seem so hopeless, where do we go from here as we hear about the reality and the depth of white supremacy as it's infiltrated not only our legal systems, political systems and structures, our social structures, our churches, but our collective consciousness? So it leads me to ask this question of all of you. Is America possible? Is the America that is the land of the free, that is the America that is the democracy of justice, is it possible?
I say no. No, it's not. It's I used to see Ta-Nehisi Coates, I used to read him and I was like, man, this guy is so pessimistic. And I came from a place of optimism and even foolishly optimistic. No, I don't think so. I don't think it will ever exist in that form. And I don't think that's, you know, a horrible prediction. I think it's just a reality of what this country and what this world is. I think it's worth aspiring to and fighting for, but this notion that I think many of us thought we were closer to that place in 2008 than we ever could be. We fooled ourselves. We really did. And it's because we misunderstood what that place really looked like. So I say no.
Anyone else want to speak to that? Rob, your response. Is America possible?
I may be hopelessly optimistic about a lot of things. I do think America is possible. But what scares me is what it's going to cost people who look like you instead of people who look like me. Because America, I'm very skeptical of what's going on right now, but I do believe that there are pioneers and there are prophets in our midst who are coming up, like you Kelly Brown Douglas, you are fabulous.
Wow.
You have been a prophet for us. James Goen was a prophet for us. We only have to listen as white folk, and we have to be willing to listen to those conversations, not only from black people, but from white people who are speaking up and speaking out in God's name. I just don't want to give up yet. I think we're on palliative care, but there still might be hope. There still might be hope yet.
I think if we want it, America is possible if we want it. I wrestle with that a lot, and what I juggle is the literal blood, sweat, and tears of my ancestors and the dreams of my ancestors. And I think that that's one of the, when you look at some of the generational differences, my mother's generation believed that black folks will help to make America what it's supposed to be. And we're not there yet. So I don't know, and I generally don't think of that question. I just think of, look, I want my people to get free. At the end of the day, I want us to build power. We gonna be here because the reality is so I want to get many of us back to the motherland, but you know what they're called? The motherland is still dealing with some of the same similar issues that we're dealing with here. So I think of our liberation in this American system, and if we really want it, it's gonna involve some really conscious people to build a lot of power to flip the system. But before we get there, we have to wake up a lot of people that look like us to say, hey, do you really want it? Because we really can. And while the conversations must happen in the white church, it has to happen in the black church. We haven't come to, the reality is of how the church came about to uphold slavery. We have not dealt with that. Yes, our music and our culture is different in our church, but whose theology are we preaching? I came to Union because I did not hear black liberation theology in the pews of the many churches I visited back home. So.
Good. Thank you. Sean, there's a question from the audience. I think the first question for you says, what are the implications of your observation that integration of white institutions has resulted in the death of independent black institutions? Do we not want to press for overcoming segregation?
Oh, I wrestle and think about that, and it's a complicated thing to unpack. One, because you run the risk of offending people who fought hard for civil rights and gains. But what I'm really saying is, the destruction of brilliant black institutions. There's an amazing podcast by Malcolm Gladwell where he talks about what really happened in Brown versus Board of Education and all the under-resourced black schools that were producing the most amazing students this country had ever seen, how those schools were all but destroyed. They're closed, literally sometimes closed down and destroyed. And so it is to say, no, it's not that integration is wrong, no, but the manner in which it happened purely benefited one group to the destruction and deficit of the other. And we have to come to grips with, okay, where are we now when we lack institutional power? There are many different forms of power that we have, but it's not institutional so much. And like there's a part of me that thinks we had more institutional power 75 years ago than we do now. Now there are other forms of power we have now that we didn't have 75 years ago, but there was a trade that happened there that it was not a fair trade.
Another question for any of you, but I think I'm going to direct it to Serene. Person says, how do you convince white people that it's important to let go of white supremacy and that they have skin in the game?
There's different answers to that, but for me, at the heart of that conversation has to be the gospel. And you have a conversation about the truth, the reality of the world in which we live. And the gospel for me as a Christian, the gospel of Jesus Christ is unambiguous. The skin in the game you have is the fact that you're living a lie. You're simply living a lie. You're not living the truth. And the call to live truly and good, I mean, there's no higher purpose in your life than to do that. But that requires a different frame of reference for how we accumulate meaning in our lives.
Which leads to a question that someone has for you, Sam. What do you think Pentecostalism can contribute to this conversation about white supremacy?
Well, I tell my students all the time that spirit-led religious practices tend to lead to egalitarianism quite often. And in the history of the church, every time there's been a spirit movement, the women were allowed to participate with more leadership. And the history of Pentecostalism here in the United States was one of racial reconciliation. Speaking in tongues had not much to do with glossolalia, but with speaking in tongues that people knew. And it created originally racial reconciliation. In fact, if Charles Parham went to Los Angeles, he wasn't happy with what he saw there because white people and black people and Latinos were worshiping together. However, in 1914, after all the white pastors had been ordained by a black minister, they started their own organization because of their racial prejudices, the Assemblies of God. So there is power there in the sense that the Spirit moves beyond structures that are there, but the structures are pretty powerful because people find very interesting ways in which they can regain the power that they feel they have lost.
Very interesting question, and it goes to some of the comments made. Person says, I'm aware of having prejudice against black persons, but because I am disciplined and have goodwill, this does not develop into bias or then into discriminatory individual action. My question is, what legislation could be enacted to address the institutionalized racism in which I wittingly or unwittingly participate, adding to what my religion calls collective sin? And it reminds me of this question, maybe we can't get to that America, but what can we get to, and what can we do to at least mitigate the kind of harm that is white supremacy?
I just finished writing an essay on the authorship of the 13th Amendment. And we've talked so much recently about the 13th Amendment, about how it did not necessarily abolish slavery, but it actually institutionalized it as an extension of the criminal justice system. But I wanted to find out, who wrote this thing? Who wrote it? What were they thinking? What was the process? And it was so disappointing. Literally, Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, was the only senator on record that I could find who was disappointed in the process. And he literally said in a letter to a friend 5 days after the 13th Amendment had passed, how he couldn't believe that they had included this clause, slavery is outlawed in America except as punishment for a crime. And he said to his friend, he said they ended the debate because everybody was hungry and ready to go to dinner. And I thought, really? The debate on the 13th Amendment was ended and halted. An amendment so essential because people were just hungry and ready to go eat. And he said, I think they'll fix it when it gets to the House. And they never did. And it gets to the root. That question is, well, what can we address? There's so much wrong in many of the amendments, in many founding documents of city governments, state governments, of our federal government. There are so many opportunities to address it. And so there were 2 or 3 examples of senators who wanted the 13th Amendment to say that not only is slavery banned and that just be it, but that all people are equal under the law. And other senators rejected it, not because of the implications of people of color, but because the men in the Senate were not yet ready for what that meant for women to have power in the country. So it's like, and they said this in their letters and memos back to and fro. Like, we have not fully come to grips with the bigotry that's hiding in plain sight in the founding documents, in the amendments of this place. And so, like, I saw that Donald Trump is, I don't know what this would look like, is considering hosting a dialogue on race or something to that. That was just out today. With some of the past, I'm gonna leave some of those pastors alone, but like even just we haven't scratched the surface of substance when it comes to race in America. Like, we're still talking about having a talk. It's like we haven't even scratched the surface.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to end with the general question. But first, I don't want to leave here without, even as you talk about the 13th Amendment, et cetera, and we're reminded, of course, of the Civil War, and in so many ways we're relitigating that today in this country, and the legacy of that in so many ways. And I know, Robert, one of the ways in which you got in trouble in your congregation is that you didn't put forth a lost cause ideology and began to talk about the Confederacy in a different way. What do we do with that history? What are we to do with the statues that reflect that history of white supremacy? How do we begin to close that gap? And if you know it's a big question, but answer for us quickly.
I was sitting in Dr. Valerie Cooper's office at Duke right before I went on the VMAs, asking her if I should really do this. And one of the things that she pointed to is in Acts 19, Demetrius is a silversmith who is building idols to Artemis, the god of the Ephesians. And Paul is about to come through this area. And when Demetrius gets word of it, he starts a riot in the city streets because he is afraid his economy of statues is going to be ruined. And Paul has to pass by. I want to be a little different than Paul. I want to go right into it. and say that enough is enough. Enough is enough. We've had these statues in our city squares not because we are honoring men who fought in a war, but because we want to suppress black people. These were not put up as signs to our Confederate dead, when in fact the statue in my hometown was rededicated in 2006 with the Confederate motto, which is "God will justify." These things are dangerous and pernicious. We have to contextualize them, but we also have to be willing to say we've got to take them down. Because without that, we have accomplished nothing. If we can't take down our idols, we are just like the Ephesians who missed the point and start riots in the streets.
Thank you. Which leads to the final question I'd like to ask all of you, and that is how do we take back the narrative that is Christianity? You know, how do we take back that narrative? We'll start here.
I think we have to let the narrative take us. That's what I'll say.
I like that quick answer.
I really like thinking about Dr. James Cone in this context, and when Elijah is handing the mantle to Elisha's like, "No, I'm good. You know, I'm good." Union Seminary, you are going to have to take the mantle of people like James Cone forward into the future, because we need you. We need people like you sitting in this room to reclaim the heart of the gospel, to reclaim that black liberation theology that has been lost to some theologians or never found in the first place.
For me, I try to impact or sway the narrative, sometimes even just by reminding people that the story of Christ, the gospel of Jesus, that it still has value in my life. And people are surprised. I don't get a chance to express that publicly nearly as much as I used to. But when people understand that there's still depth and that there's still even a theology behind what I do, and when I get a chance to express that, and there's so much that Dr. Cone said and did is so valuable for me. And when I get a chance to tell people, like, no, fighting for justice is my ministry, it reintroduces to them a different expression of how to live this out.
Good, thank you.
I remember I was really exasperated of, organizing in congregations and trying to organize in more congregations, and at a point of giving up. And so many of my peers who were leaving church, who were looking at other traditions like, this is a white man's religion, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and I got demoralized. And what gave me life was God of the oppressed. And since then, I have been answering calls from millennials who are at the verge of losing their faith, and really telling them how this book is, it's our story. This is our story, and just breaking it down for people. So what I say is, it's about spreading the good news, and it's about spreading the good news of black liberation through the Bible and correcting bad theology that we see all the time in our communities. And that's one way. And just, again, social media and communications, leveraging that and putting those narratives out in the forefront.
So I'm going to let you have the last word.
I think use as little scripture as possible is problematic. When liberals use it back and forth, it's almost silly, in my opinion. And I've decided to be un aguijón. I like the word in Spanish because it sounds like a pick. Be a pick in the system, a thorn on the side of the system. When you see something that doesn't sound right or look right, speak up. That's the gospel.
And I think there's no better way to end there. Speak up. Thank you all for being with us.